During the Napoleonic Wars, Norway was blockaded by a British fleet because Denmark was on the wrong side of the war. And one of the things that happened was that they ran out of salt. Hauge, I don't know how the story was communicated, but they let him out of jail, and he went to the seaside and supervised the establishment of a plant to extract salt from the ocean water. He had a plan for this, and it was successful. And when he finished his work on it, they put him back in jail again.
Swell. Government gratitude.
There were 28 hearings, 600 witnesses were called, and he was asked 554 questions, to which official legal questions to which he had to respond. Eventually, only 2 charges remained. And by the way, the government was getting a lot of pressure at this point. I guess we can, this was kind of a celebrated case, and it was, news of it was spreading beyond. And I mean, what in the world are the authorities doing in this? It was becoming notorious. And this poor fellow, this farm boy, that he would be treated like this, you know. And we should mention also that some of the people who were his followers, by the way, who had been touched by this movement, were called the Friends. That was kind of the title they took to themselves, the Friends. Friends of Hauge. Sometimes they were also known as, by the way, and this comes up in the different Scandinavian revival movements, readers. The readers, which is a lovely word, isn't it? Because they became, as awakened Christians or new Christians, they became notorious for buying books and reading them. They had a library now that they didn't have before, and people referred to them in kind of in an insulting way. Oh, good grief, she's become a reader now. Yeah, like nobody else was reading. But it was actually a term, and not a term of endearment, that was used to refer to the people whose lives had been touched in this time of awakening. Some of these friends of Hauge were becoming quite well-to-do and influential politically as well. And they were speaking up, and the government was getting nervous. And so the pressure was put that this would be brought to a head. And only 2 charges finally remained out of the 554, only 2. He violated the conventicle law. He had meetings in parishes, small group meetings without the approval of pastors, okay? And secondly, in his books or some quotations, he had made insulting remarks about church and civil authorities. Probably called them whitewashed walls or who knows what, you know, in that way. And so he, I guess, confessed that he was guilty to these 2 charges, and of these 2 charges, and he was finally sentenced with a fine. That was all. A fine which was paid for by his friends. I think there were some court costs included in it as well. He was 43 years old and broken physically, not spiritually. He still provided a certain amount of leadership, quiet leadership for the movement, which was continuing on and growing and expanding. There was an army of lay preachers who were out there now doing what he had done. His friends bought a farm for him to live on. He married the housekeeper. She died, married another lady there during this time, fathered 4 children, did a little bit more writing, and actually was a national hero at this point. Government and church leaders making pilgrimages to the farm to talk to him, to ask him advice. gain from his wisdom. Yeah, just a total turnabout. Yeah, probably the most famous man in the country. And what was happening as a result of this awakening is that we need to say people were being politically awakened also, and out of the rural areas was coming a political party of Haugianers, as some of them were called, and they eventually ended up in politically taking over the country. They ended up with organizing the majority in Parliament and the first cabinet. I have a copy of a marvelous picture, big picture. Someone brought it to Summer Institute many years ago and said, "What in the world is this?" And there were pictures of several people on there, and last names were there, and at least two of them, I think, were Sverdrup. And they said, "Now, does this have something to do with the AFLC or whatever?" I had to do some digging, but it was found in the attic in a home of some Norwegian immigrants in Wisconsin. It was the first cabinet of this takeover group when you might say when the rural party with the Haugians represented in it took over the government. And this was the cabinet. And the people brought to America this great big huge portrait of these political leaders in that country because they were rejoicing that the Haugianers had taken over. That's really what it represented to them. Remarkable thing. Remarkable time. When he died on the 29th of March in 1824, he was surrounded by friends and loved ones. A few months before he died, he wrote a last testament to his friends. He had some words of criticism. There was one fellow, Haugvoldstad, I think his name was, if I remember right, something like that, and who he thought was trying to imitate him in his mannerisms and so on. And he was talking about people not imitating others, but being yourself with the gifts that God has given you and so on, but made a really strong point. Don't leave your church. Yes, excuse me. Yes, the church has been bad to us. We have been mistreated. Don't leave the Lutheran Church, he said. This is our spiritual home. This is where the truth is found. Stay with the church and be faithful to it as much as you possibly are able to do. And one of the curious things that is asked, and I often will compare Norwegian and Swedish evangelicalism. In Sweden, there was a great exodus from the Lutheran Church. And we have denominations well represented here in the Twin City area. Evangelical Free Church, Evangelical Covenant Church, Baptist General Conference, all coming out of Swedish Lutheranism. You go to Bethel Seminary, as I did, take some studies there, and one of my teachers said, you can't understand Bethel and the Baptist General Conference unless you understand our Lutheran roots. Yeah, interesting. Why? And I was asked this at my orals with my thesis there. Why did the Norwegians stay Lutheran and the Swedes didn't? And they don't know. They're curious about it. And my response is, part of the answer is the legacy of Hauge. That's part of the answer. Another part of the answer is the next individual to whom we will be introduced. And the next wave of awakening that came to Norway. Now the Haugian movement lived on after Hauge, guided by certain principles, a belief in true conversion, emphasis on the working of God's law, repentance, living faith, emphasis on holy living and evangelism. But some of the writers who look at the movement in the years following Hauge suggest that it became too law-focused and somewhat legalistic in its forms. There was a corrective. Professor Ivar Iverson, who taught at Luther Seminary many years ago, writes of a corrective during the 1830s and tells the story of two of the Haugianer leaders who were out walking and had a Luther experience. There was an electrical storm and a tree struck by lightning, and they thought they were going to die. And in the midst of this all, it just like it stripped all of their legalism away. And if I'm going into eternity, what can I hang on to? And it was Jesus only. It was Jesus only. And they brought, as it were, to some extent, a new wave of a new emphasis on justification into the movement. But I think many today, when they think of the Haugian movement, think of it as being very legalistic, very much law-centered in its preaching, lots of law, very little gospel. I tend to see some of these things at times in waves. In my opinion, the emphasis of pietism, Lutheran pietism on sanctification, was what was needed in the life of the church at that time, and it was a corrective. And perhaps during these early years of the Haugian movement, and combating rationalistic influence, there was need for stronger law preaching than there might have been at some other times. We can say also that it was primarily a peasant movement, it was rural, and there was a growing tension between the friends of the revival and the church. And there was a question whether the movement would continue on within the church or separate from it. The next wave of awakening, I like to say, was also led by an unlikely individual. The first unlikely individual was a peasant farm boy, a village handyman with a 3rd or 4th grade education. The second unlikely individual was a theological professor. You aren't going to get much fire out of those guys, isn't that right? Yeah, all right. 1822 to 1894. Gisle Jansen, to pronounce it correctly. Denmark finally gave in to one of the Norwegian demands and established a training program for pastors at the university in Christiania, which would later become Oslo. And in 1849, Gisle Jansen was one of the professors who was appointed to teach at that faculty. During the early 1850s, he was asked to conduct Bible hours, they were called, evening services in the city. And it was the same time, or right afterward, and they were quite popular. People were coming, lay people were coming, well attended, wanting to hear his Bible lectures. A cholera epidemic hit the city during this time. And there were people dying. And it created a great deal of concern and fear and unrest. And some of that unrest was channeled into these meetings. They outgrew every building they were in until finally they were meeting in the largest auditorium in the city, in the capital city. It just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people coming to these services. And Jansen kept on preaching, teaching. It was more teaching than preaching. And again, I believe it was Iverson writing about it, one of the writers anyway, telling about it, saying that it was like Palm Sunday. the crowds of people calling Hosanna. It was an outpouring of joy and trust in Jesus Christ. And it was just this powerful, powerful movement throughout the city. Spontaneous, not organized, not planned, not programmed, and anything like that at all. I have another theory about it. I talked to someone who had heard Janssen teach later on in his life after this. And they said, I shouldn't say they heard, they knew, had talked to an elderly person who had heard. I'm not quite that old. And they said that they were really disappointed. He was boring. Yeah. They said he was very much tied to his notes and kind of giving a sort of a formal lecture, and it was like, this is the Gisli Janssen we've heard about, the revival preacher, but you know, he never was a revival preacher. And I'm amazed sometime in some of these accounts how God can take a poor old stick like some of us in his timing and use us in a way that we don't even anticipate. And then when that is over, we're the same way we always were, but people are disappointed in us. Do you know what I'm talking about? All right, yeah. Jonathan Edwards is a wonderful example of that. Thank you. Yeah, wonderful example. Boy, I think if we belonged to his church, we'd probably transfer over to an Arminian church or something. Yeah, sorry about that, John, but it would have been kind of dull. Yeah, with him reading his manuscripts there and everything. Yeah. Gisli Janssen is a good example of that. He was joined on the faculty by a very remarkable man named Karl Kaspari. I don't know if I have a picture. No, I don't. Karl Kaspari, C-A-S-P-A-R-I. Doesn't sound very Norwegian, does it? Karl Kaspari was a converted Jew who had come to faith in Christ during his theological studies in Germany. And Janssen met him while he was there, had a great respect for him, and through his influence, he was invited to come and to be a professor there at this far northern school. And the two men were a team for the Lord. If you visit Jerusalem today, you'll find the Kaspari Institute, a center for study and for ministry to the Jewish people, named after this Karl Kaspari. It's located in Jerusalem today. He will still be quoted in footnotes, in commentaries on, Old Testament commentaries on Jeremiah, I believe, and some other of the Old Testament books, where they will still be drawing from some of his insights. That he was an Old Testament, great, famous Old Testament scholar in his day, and coming with the rich Hebrew background that he would have personally. Janssen and Kaspari, by the way, whose families intermarried and who are even buried by one another. I saw their graves in Oslo near one of the churches. They would influence a whole generation of seminary students. And this is the second wave of awakening as it came. Now it hit the parsonages. Now it was the clergy. And it was the young clergy coming out of this university training who were coming to these parishes throughout the country. And where before the pastor had been an opponent of the awakening movement, now was a friend and a brother. And it was just like night and day. I like to picture a scene something like this, which probably took place many times. Here the believers are meeting in this farmhouse for their conventicle meeting, and all of a sudden there's a knock on the door, and somebody looks out and they say, oi, 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 oi vey, whatever. They say, it's the pastor, it's the priest. Oh, are we in trouble? The sheriff's not far behind. But he seems to be by himself. I suppose you have to open the door, opened the door, and the pastor says, "I understand there's a meeting here tonight. May I come in?" He says quietly and respectfully, and they, "Yeah, I suppose, he's going to be taking notes, and there's going to be trouble, you can be sure." And he comes in and meets with them and listens to what's being said, whoever's leading, and perhaps even takes part in prayer. And at the end of the time, the people look at one another and they say, "Oh my, he's a brother." He's a brother. He knows the Lord too. And they were used to the pastor coming as such an opponent, such an enemy. And now, pastor who wanted to encourage this life within the churches like that, whole new thing. And it came out of this second wave of awakening, which I believe is the second part of the answer as to why the evangelical movement stayed within the Lutheran Church in Norway in a way that it didn't in Sweden. Janssen ministered for 10 hectic years, it's been said, and then continued his teaching after that, lived to a ripe old age. But the fire, at least within Norway, or within Oslo, certainly did not burn as bright during his latter years. I think we need to say something also about the third wave of revival that came to Norway. And for that, we need a bit of a background on the evangelical movement in Sweden, because the third wave of spiritual life was Swedish in origin. Sweden also saw the era of pietism with the same pluses and minuses. There was the separatistic pietism, which was much attacked by the official state church and the government. And there was the more wholesome variety, which found a place in the life of some of the churches, which influenced, and there in Sweden also, this whole tradition of readers during this time. I need to mention also, because it comes up in the U.S., something very peculiar about this particular era of pietism. The only ones who really write about it are some of the covenant historians. And the last result in the stories is they just don't know what to make of it. And that is something that is called preaching sickness. Preaching sickness. There was, especially, in various parts of Sweden, especially in the southwest district called Småland, there was an outbreak of a kind of an ecstatic experience that took place in these conventicle groups that would go something like this. Here is a group of people meeting for Bible study, for fellowship. All of a sudden, one of them, and often it was the least one you would expect. It could be maybe an older person who never said a word at the meetings, or a younger person, flat on the floor, unconscious, knocked out.
Didn't they call it sleep preachers?
Sometimes that term is used too, sleep preaching. But preaching sickness is the term that was used. And because while they were unconscious then, they began to preach. They began to talk. Often it was a word of admonition or encouragement or something like that. The person who did it had no memory of it afterwards. And sometimes it was extremely pointed and personal. In fact, it could be someone saying, Mrs. So-and-so over here, if you say Peterson or Johnson, you got a good chance of hitting it, I suppose. Mrs. So-and-so over here has been cheating her neighbors, when she's selling them eggs or something like that. Could be something like that. Some very personal, just very precise detail of sin in someone else's life. And the one account that I think is incredibly credible is Eric Norelius, who comes to America eventually and becomes one of the founders of the Augustana Synod, a great churchman and a thoroughly Orthodox Lutheran leader. He said it happened to him as a young man. And when he woke up, he didn't know what had happened, but he said there were people on their knees praying, weeping, crying out to God for mercy. He says, I have no idea what happened in any way like that at all. But it happened. And it happened to hundreds of people, according to some of the Covenant historians who write about it. And some thought it was mental disorder. Some thought it was a special gift from God for this period of time. May I say also, from the reading I've done on it, there was very little gospel in this. And Norelius himself says that he still lacked assurance of salvation in the midst of it all. He said, we were so law-burdened, and there was such an emphasis during this time on repentance, and are you sure you've repented enough? And is there something of which you haven't repented? That he said, and one of the covenant men says the same, it's kind of like this, there was something that burst out in these groups in the life of the people. What do we make of it? I don't know. I think the covenant people in the last analysis think that it was real. It ended. It stopped at a certain period of time. And it stopped in the wave of revival that came under the leadership of Karl Olaf Rosenius. Another unlikely individual. Rosenius, a seminary dropout. He was son of a parsonage, grew up in the parsonage of a family that were pietistic Lutherans. He grew up among the readers. He knew the devotional readings and the rest, had a strong background in that, went to seminary, and had financial difficulties there, some health problems, but he was totally turned off. Although I don't know what the Swedish is for that, to use the whatever language. He was discouraged, disgusted by the low level of spiritual life among the seminary students. He didn't find much concern there for the things of the Lord.
This is in Sweden.
Sweden. This is in Sweden. Rosenius then ended up leaving the seminary, getting a job as a tutor for a well-to-do family, and heartsick, still in spiritual darkness in many ways. There was it's a longer story than I want to tell, but there was a Methodist chaplain who had come to Sweden and taught himself the Swedish language, who was sent there to minister to some English-speaking workers there was an English industrialist who started a factory there and commissioned this man by the name of Scott to come and to serve as chaplain to the English-speaking people. And he had such a burden for the Swedish people that he learned the language and ended up preaching to the Swedes and starting the first independent church in Sweden, by the way, Bethlehem Chapel in Stockholm, the capital. And he became a counselor to Rosenius, and under his ministry, Rosenius came to a strong gospel-centered assurance of salvation and began to edit a newspaper, Christian newspaper called The Pietist. And the influence of that paper would be incredibly widespread, brought together all these different strains of spiritual awakening that were going on in Sweden under a very strong gospel-centered and very Lutheran leadership. Rosenius, though he had been influenced by this Wesleyan individual, who, by the way, ended up, after a riot, being kicked out of the country, and that's another story. Rosenius took over, this young man, probably still in his 20s, early 30s at the most, took over as the preacher, the leader. Bethlehem Chapel wasn't reopened for years, and most of his ministry was writing. Most of it was writing. Some small group meetings, but incredible influence. And his writings, Faithful Guide to Peace with God, Believer Free from the Law, his devotional commentary on Romans, were taken out of some of his other writings in the paper. I met a German pastor, German-speaking pastor, from Germany, up in Canada. And I was in his office and looking at his bookshelf, and there, in German, number of books, Rosenius. And I said, "You're familiar with Rosenius in Germany also?" Pointed to it, he said, "That is my theology." That is my theology. German Lutheran pastor. Ivor Iverson, again quoting him from Luther Seminary, says, "No one since Luther divided law and gospel so well as Rosenius did." And you can see that from some of his writings as well. Some available for us in English, but translated and spread all around the world. Influenced through writing, which is really quite remarkable, isn't it? And that wave of gospel-centered revival crossed the border into Norway and led to what may have been the most, some would say, the most fruitful time of awakening in Norwegian church life. Strong throughout the country. Attacked, by the way, by some of the older Haugians who felt that there was not enough law there, and still a little uncomfortable with it. What happened after the death of Rosenius? When he died in 1868, he appointed as his successor a Lutheran pastor by the name of P.P. Waldenstrom. Waldenstrom, they'd say. Waldenstrom with a W. And Waldenstrom provided for a time a balanced leadership, but then developed a kind of a peculiar theory of the atonement of Christ, which ended up becoming very controversial. And the awakening movement became divided over it. Under Waldenstrom's leadership emerged the denomination that we know today as the Covenant Church. Mission Covenant Church, it was called initially, and in some areas kind of remained more of a Lutheran emphasis, but today is a completely distinct denomination with its seminary and college in the Chicago area, North Park, and a denomination which, by and large, has departed, at least in its leadership and in its training, from the strong conservative evangelical heritage that once was there, and that's a real tragedy. Those of you who might be familiar with the book Battle for the Bible will read in there about the decline of the teaching of the position of Scripture within the seminary of the Covenant denomination. And it's really sad to read about, because many of their local churches are still in their understanding of Scripture, still quite sound. But the denomination has moved far, and how long it'll take to penetrate the local churches is hard to say. And that's sad. As I've already suggested, not only the Covenant group broke, but you see the evangelical free people leaving. There was a Baptist movement, a Methodist movement that came, and other movements as well that fractured Swedish evangelicalism. And one of the interesting quotes from an old Covenant pastor is, he said, the revival, how did he put it, didn't die. He says, we argued it away. Something to that effect, because there was so much battling among the people during that period of time that the real concern for people getting right with God and with one another was sidetracked, unfortunately. The remnant of this coming forth into Norway was very powerful, and I think we need to recognize the heritage of that and the importance of it in the fact that many of these immigrants who came to America were people who honored the heritage of Hans Nielsen Hauge and who had been influenced by the gospel joy and release that was in this final wave of awakening as well. And let's credit this also with the beginning of the world missionary movement that has come out of Norway. I think that some of you are familiar with that, others perhaps not so much. But Norway per capita still produces more world missionaries than any other country per capita. The mission societies are distinct from the state church. I think they're all independent. And people support them over and beyond their tax money that's paid to the churches. And they are doing just an incredible work of missionary outreach around the world that it can't be compared. We do more, but not per capita. For a small country to be doing what they're doing. The country that may be passing them up, by the way, Korea, yeah. Korea is at the point of passing them up. And I just read recently a report now where there were something like 2,000 Korean Christians that were kicked out of Afghanistan because they had gone in there in some kind of a major outreach of some sort and they got into trouble. What I gather reading about it and talking to my son who lived for about 9 years in Korea, he said the Korean missionaries are not culturally sensitive. They could give two hoots for cultural sensitivity. They just go into this country and slam, bam, confrontational evangelism, turn or burn, and they have some success, but they also get into a lot of trouble in the process as well. The one congregation that he attended for a time over there, they started an English service which he and some of his friends led. And some Filipino ladies came who were garment workers, and they couldn't speak Korean, but they could speak some English. And some of them became Christians then through this service, in this English-speaking service in the Korean church, and immediately the congregation was there to send some of them, support them, to go back to the Philippines as missionaries. Yeah, it was that kind of that's a part of it. Wow, hey, we've got Filipinos here who are new Christians. You got a country to reach, and away they go. And that's the kind of zeal that's been there, and God grant that some of that would rub off on us as well here in the concern for reaching the world for Jesus Christ. Yeah, but Norway is surely to be commended. The last time that we visited with Carl Wisloff about this, and he just died recently, up in his 90s, a grand, towering figure of a spiritual leader in Norwegian church life, teacher at one of the seminaries for many years. He said to some of us, the leaven has grown weak. The leaven has grown weak, he says. And the life that was once there is not there in any way like it once was. And what that will mean, some of our folks talked to some of the Norwegian missionaries in Africa. We worked together with them in Tanzania, and they are fearful of the future for their mission movements as to where the people are going to be trained and what kind of an emphasis they're going to be bringing. Yes?
Is it basically Lutheran missionaries?
Yes.
Because I understand that a lot of the Lutheran state churches are pretty dead.
Yes,
spiritually.
yeah.
So is this missionary movement more from the lay people, this house
Yeah,
church
yeah.
movement?
One of the things that emerged during this last wave of awakening in Norway during the Rosenian era is what is called the prayer house movement, in Norwegian the bedehus. And they actually put up like little school buildings is what they were, not ever intended to be churches. And that's where people would meet for Bible study, that's where people would meet for prayer meetings, and that's where they hold their mission meetings. Someone who had been over there, well, Dr. Olson used to say, if you're going to go to Norway and want to get in touch with spiritual life, don't go to church. He'd say, go to a meeting in the Vedahus, and there you'll find it. The message, we heard somebody who had gone over there and they said, well, you bought a ticket, which sounds really strange. You bought a ticket to go, and you sat there in the pew, and they would have a long Bible study or some type of thing going on, and then there's a tray in front of you, and they have a break, and you hoist that tray up, and they bring box lunches in. You're going to eat because you're going to be staying a while, and then they've got something after that. I was told that when the missionaries are home on furlough, they don't travel on missionary deputation, they all serve as evangelists. And I don't know if that's still the case or not. But as they are out serving as evangelists, they are encouraging, in that way, support for world missions as well. And it's an interesting concept that has been. Yes?
One of the connections more recent connections that we would probably have with that Norwegian mission would be the Lutheran Mission Society that work in Alaska.
In Alaska, okay.
Oscar Brown, started that mission, came from Norway to start that mission in Alaska. And anyway, that has traveled down. It had Norwegian. Their newsletter was in Norwegian up until '72, I believe, and then now it is in English.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that influence is there.
The influence was there. And some of the, just talking to one of the directors of one of their societies a few years ago, he said, our concern is to go into now difficult areas where there's no gospel witness of any kind. We don't want to go in competing with other churches that are already there. If there's other evangelical denominations there, let them do the work. He said, we want to go into areas where there is a greater need. And they're looking at some of the stands, these new countries that have emerged out of the Soviet Union and so on in that area. And looking for open doors and still faithful. But there's all kind of fun things about out of this heritage. There's a little bit of I don't know what you want to call it, pride in the fact that you don't get ordained. And being ordained is kind of selling out to the establishment. Okay. One of the men who was seminary degree and really good credentials, in terms of his training. He came to this country for advanced degree, and they said, well, when were you ordained? I haven't been ordained. So he was with one of the mission societies. And he said, they look upon that over here in this country as means there's something wrong with you. You haven't fulfilled some requirement or something like that. He said in Norway, it's sort of a badge of honor in that way too. And there's also kind of a humility with it. I don't know, it's maybe not always it could be at times a false humility. I'm visiting with this man who's very prominent in one of the mission societies. Well, he says, I'm just a simple layman. Oh, that's good. We're talking a little bit, and then when I was doing my doctoral studies in theology at Dominicans faculty. Okay, yeah, but I'm just a simple layman. I don't know about things like that. Some of this comes through, in visiting with these folks too. And it's a unique heritage in regards to that, and it comes out of the Haugian times, I think. That to be a lay pastor, and you run into it in some of these groups yet, where that this is better. This is better. You're probably closer to the Lord than somebody who's got a head full of head knowledge, only. And we yes.
The Pocket Testament League, they want pastors to be required to hand out Bibles.
Okay.
So if you're a pastor, you can't.
Yeah.
You Cat billing.
Yeah.
They go out and they finance it,
Well, isn't this true with the Gideons? They don't accept
Gideons,
pastors, do
yeah.
they? Yeah, sure. In that way too. It's a unique heritage. You're standing. Is this a warning?
Time
me?
to go.
It's time to go. All right. It's time to go. I'm so grateful for Ron, and I'm smiling at him. I'm going to look with favor upon him in class this fall.
I hope so.
He's being such a help to me. Thank you very much for your attention.